You want me to pull it?
Yeah, actually. You can put on a Pizza Moss and a Chef Life Radio.
You can split jerseys like they do, like the mom. Oh,
yeah, multiple layers.
Oh, 3 o'clock.
It is.
And we are live.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
Thank you for joining us for the first round of breakout sessions on this final day. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Adam Lamb and Kimberly Schaub. Adam is a professional chef with 40 years of experience in standalone restaurants, hotels, resorts, multi-entertainment facilities, and senior living communities. Now his mission is to coach and mentor chefs and hospitality professionals on leadership, emotional intelligence, communication, and relationship skills at cheflifecoaching.com. He is the host and produces 3 popular hospitality podcasts, Chef Life Radio, the Line Check podcast, and Turning the Table with Jim Taylor of Benchmark 60. Chef Adam is a highly regarded consultant for the hospitality industry on the subjects of change management, improving organizational culture, and internal community building. He speaks on the topics of mental health awareness and addiction in the industry, rites of passage, initiation, and other men's topics. Kimberly is a research chef and senior food scientist focused on business development for Griffith Foods, and she founded the Peas on Moss website and podcast in 2009. With a nutritional science background, leadership training from the U.S. Air Force, and culinary scientist certification from the Research Chefs Association, Kimberly brings a unique eye to culinary arts, food technology, and agri-food sustainability. Peas on Moss itself is a wordplay on mise en place, and the mission is to highlight the varied pathways and successes in the food manufacturing industry. Peas on Moss leverages the podcast platform to invite a larger audience to consider the craft and business of getting food to their grocery store shelves and onto their plates. Through conversational interviews, Kimberly invites the guests to share their career experiences and expertise, fostering a space where food science and technology are shared in an accessible way. Please welcome Kimberly now.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. And welcome.
This is really fun. And thank you all for coming out and supporting. It really means a lot.
Yeah, we are streaming live to Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. So there'll be a time for Q&A towards the end of the time together, and we're just deeply grateful that you found this important enough to show up today. So thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to kick off with a question and check in with you all. How are you doing? It is the very last day of my favorite conference. I am biased here. With my favorite people. And so we want to do a quick check-in with you. So for those who have been in school in the last 4.5 years, you are familiar with a Slido. So go ahead and scan the QR code and it'll take you to a quick questionnaire of how you are doing.
Yeah, there's a word cloud and a couple questions that we'd love to pose to everybody because actually your feedback helps inform what we're going to go ahead and talk about. So.
All right, so how many of you have heard of the Peas on Moss podcast? I see some hands. And I have to say, I have bias this audience just a little bit. The fun thing about being a energetic volunteer and who gets voluntold for activities is I do get to know people who are in our organization, and I can actually look around the room and say, oh, I've done some things with you, and we chatted, we talked me off the edge, talking through some science. So, yeah, I'm excited to be here. So we're going to do quick introductions about ourselves. So this is me. This is a photo montage of me and my life and the things I'm really proud of. My grandparents are in the first picture, and my grandfather was a pork farmer out of Southwest Minnesota. And so my relationship with food started at a very early age. And it has continued. So you can see that I just loved showing up for food, eating food, sharing food, talking about food. There's a picture of me. I actually was judging the Upcycled Food Cooking Competition. It was a student competition where, honestly, a lot of RCA hustlers are from. And, you know, I think the big takeaway from a lot of these snapshots are that I love the people that we work with every day to bring great food to tables and to grocery store shelves, your delivery. And so you can just see that throughout all of that, it's all about sharing that community experience. Again, focusing on the people. Our product is food, and that's how we serve our world, but we do that together, not alone.
Fantastic. And hi, my name's Adam Lamb, and I've been doing the podcast since 2014. It was a drunken love letter back to the crew that I missed. I was working at the Omni Homestead in Virginia, one of the oldest resorts in the country, and in season it was about 125 people that I managed, and fell in love with a Canadian woman. So I was in Toronto without a job permit, and I thought, well, what do I do now? And I said, yeah, I know, I'll start a podcast, as if I knew what that was about at all. And ultimately came up with a series called How to Be a Better Chef, the 10 Tenets of Aspirational Leadership, and then took that on the road, went to American Culinary Federation shows, National Restaurant Association shows. I did a lot of speaking. I'm a published author. And as I saw the pandemic roll out and the industry lost 6 million jobs, I thought if there was ever a time to bring back the podcast, this would be the time to do it, because maybe this would provide folks an opportunity to really think and own their decision to re-enter the workforce, and to do that with what I consider to be probably the most important work to be done, which is getting grounded in your core values, so that you end up with an employer that actually shares those same core values, as opposed to being a victim of your circumstance, which for a good portion of my career I was. And so I came to the decision to focus my coaching around emotional intelligence, communication skills, and relationship building skills, because in my career, every time there was a breakdown, it was one of those three things. So I thought, if I'm having that same problem, I imagine that there's others out there that do that. So thanks. And as we talked about Slido, for any of you that would like to get a copy of the slide deck, and also an ebook that I produced called The Emotionally Intelligent Chef, click on this. It'll take me a day to update that website, but it's a click to join. And so we really appreciate you, again, stepping in.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so download the ebook and the presentation. So let's check in again.
Yep.
It almost feels like a shift change, and it's very early.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a temperature chart that's produced by a company called chowco.org. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is mental health and wellness in the industry. And Chowco is a peer-to-peer support organization that is specifically designed for the culinary industry, although it's open to all hospitality. They do some really important things, like every day of the week, there is a Zoom call that you can join and talk about where you're at and what you're feeling. So they came up with this temperature chart as a way to kind of break the ice. And so the question is how are you, really? Because very often it's like, hey, how you doing? Oh yeah, I'm great. And so they came up with these rare, medium, well, and well. So Kimberly, I'd like to ask you, what's your temperature today?
My awakeness level is kind of, I think we're blue and bleeding at this point. But, and I actually, this, again, like I said, this is my favorite trade show with my favorite people. So I am medium rare.
Fantastic. I would say the same thing. And I find it very, very interesting that there's so many different, there's contrasting emotions there. So I could be content and thankful and calm. I could also be present and grumpy at the same time. So I don't know about you, but very often I'm feeling that way. So I'd say I'm between medium and medium rare. And to be honest, I was a little nervous about today, because this is the first time we're doing it in front of a live audience. And you and I have worked together, but it's always such a pleasure, because we never really know what's going to come up.
Sure,
Yeah.
and I think double clicking on that a bit, kind of feeling, I did see some nods around. Let's explore that a little bit, because the thing about emotions and about how we're doing at the moment is really being honest with ourselves and with each other. How am I showing up in this moment, right? Meeting to meeting. And how many of us have had meetings stringled together? It's just like, okay, I have to pee. And to do that, I will either abandon this meeting or be late to the next meeting. What do you want? And just kind of thinking about that, like, okay, what are we doing here where we take the meeting all the way to the 59. So I think my first, hey, y'all, let's get this together. Do not do this to your teammates. Don't take it through 59. So hey, let's cut it at the 5 till moment if we're actually at home and are just hanging up on one meeting and dialing into another. If you're in the lab or on the line, like, give yourself some transit time, and forgot my stuff or dropped my phone somewhere in time. We really don't have to go as far as we do. We can, right? But if we're constantly sprinting, then we can't actually speed up, right?
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly valuable thing, and I came to understand that I actually need a pattern interrupt. So very often I would come home and I'd meet my wife, and we'd be talking, and about 20 minutes later she'd say, "You know, I don't work for you, right?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You're still in chef mode." And I didn't really understand what she was talking about, and so that's where I started to develop this thing that I call a pattern interrupt, which is, you know, maybe 10, 15 minutes where I'm either doing a meditation or listening to music that really opens up my heart, such that I can transition away from one way of being and step into another way of being, because, you know, I didn't want to be alone. I love my wife. I want to keep that relationship going. And while one way of being is perfect for work, it's not necessarily transitions very well to other relationships in our lives.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And really understanding where your values lie and saying, okay, are these actions that I'm taking either in the big picture or the instant moment, are these aligning with my values? Am I showing up the way that, if you took a snapshot of me, is this showing up the way that aligns with how I really want my story to be told? If you were to be edited on a TV show, and we've all watched those chefs get edited on shows, or we have plenty of movies about chefs. You know, would you be proud of those moments? And no, you're still a human. There are going to be moments you're not always proud of. But in the net, can you say that we showed up the way that we'd be proud of? Do we want our kids to see us, our families, our peers, my bosses, you know? Would we want to be edited that way? Yes, no? If no, what do we do to fix that?
Yeah, I had a moment last night around the bar where there was a schism with the service, and I was very frustrated. And the bartender was trying to ask me what was going on, and there was, you know, crowded, and I realized, you know, I'm not going to get into this right now. So I felt like I conducted myself appropriately, but then on reflection, when I was back upstairs, I'm like, man, I could have handled that so much better. So we're all just human.
We are, yeah, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, as long as we recognize the humanity in one another. And I don't think at that moment I was actually recognizing the humanity in this frustrated, harried cocktail server. And, you know, I completely own that and regret it. So I get to go back to her today and make amends and say, hey, listen, you know, I'm not just going to let that sit out there without rounding back to it and cleaning it up a little bit, I guess is what I would say.
Let me double click on that, because, you know, say if 24 hours do go by, I guess that's not how that math works in general science, but pretend that I did that math right, right? You know, if you're like, hey, I didn't show up really well, you just like call up that coworker, call up that random stranger server and say, hey, I showed up poorly yesterday. Like, what's that entry look like?
Well, I mean, throughout my career, I've been in situations where I've had to own the results of my team. So I've gotten very good at falling on my sword. And I don't mean that as a way of like genuflecting or making it something that I don't give a lot of thought to. But I do know that coming back to a situation, regardless if it's 20 minutes, an hour, days, or months, and re-entering that conversation with an open heart and owning my shit really goes a long way into cleaning things up. And it may not necessarily affect anybody around us, like somebody who actually was listening to me talking or whatever, but I get that. That's not what I want to clean up. I want to clean up the person that I had the interaction with. And, you know, AA and NA get into this a lot with making amends. And I've had conversations with folks years later, and to be able to say, you know, you deserve better from me. It might not take, you know, the sting out, but it certainly helps smooth the way so that there's another opportunity or another type of relationship that's open to that. And that takes me actually being aware enough to want to renegotiate those. You know, can I renegotiate this relationship with you from this space? You know, and this is what I'm committed to doing.
I like that you're leading with questions. You know, you're like, hey, can we revisit this?
Yeah.
You know, years later, months, or however long that is. And I think there really isn't a statute of limitation on fixing something.
Yeah,
right? I showed up for before, and it's like, okay, well, can we talk about this? And let's label how this feels. I feel awkward about this because I didn't show up in a way that I'm proud of, and I'd really like to fix that. I'd like to understand if we can have a different type of working relationship or connection in the future. But the first, I think, is labeling that was not great. I didn't show up the way that I'm proud of now.
Yeah. And I just want to make sure that, you know, we highlight this because 5 years ago at a chef's convention, these types of conversations probably wouldn't be happening. Yesterday we were doing a little bit of man on the street or woman on the street interviews as people were coming by. And one of the things that we kept hearing, or that I kept hearing, it kind of opened up my eyes, was a lot of people were using the word empathy, like empathy towards their customers, empathy towards their suppliers, empathy towards their coworkers. And again, I just think this is a revolution in our culinary culture. And I think, I say it, but I think, we got to thank COVID for it. In my darkest moment in 2011, there was no organization, nobody that I could turn to with, the pain in my heart, such that I could actually get the work done. Now, later I found out that there were men's groups and things of that sort. And there certainly weren't organizations like the Burnt Chef Project, like Chowco, who are now making all their efforts towards making sure that there are resources out there to anybody who's willing to look at the website. I mean, the statistics of people in our industry who've had a mental health incident in their career is like 4 out of 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so I know this is probably something that a lot of us don't necessarily talk about. And it doesn't surprise me that, this conversation still has a long way to go, because to be frank, one of the things that we get to do is we get to destigmatize the conversation. And the only way that we do that is by, again, opening up our hearts and sharing our stories. I found that I can't ask anybody else to be vulnerable and transparent with me if I'm not willing to do that first and kind of model what that might look like. But the problem is that if we don't destigmatize these conversations, we're going to lose more people. And during the pandemic, I just got sick and tired of scrolling through my Facebook feed, and there's another picture of a chef, and a chef gone before his time. Can I get a herd? And I just became so pissed, because it's like all of us are just standing around watching this happen, and nobody's actually wanting to do anything about it. So I'm really happy to have these types of conversations now, because if not now, when?
Yeah, when it's too late.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think for me, because I came up in 2 different cultures where we did not talk about our feelings, right? I came up in the military and then in kitchens after that.
And we share the Air Force, by the way. Did you know that?
Yeah. And I think part of that is we're trained to pack feelings away really deep, because we need to respond to a situation at this moment. So the job that I had that nobody sees on my resume is I was a mortuary officer, and the deaths that I processed were all suicides. So
22 a day.
yeah.
And I also want to kind of highlight that the compartmentalization. That's a very masculine trait. The feminine does not necessarily do that, because everything is connected to everything. And I mean this in the best possible case, because I feel very strongly that while HR would like to tell us that everybody is the same, I know from personal experience that the masculine and the feminine are completely different in the way they process information, the way they talk about it, the way they're motivated. And so for us to actually have open and frank conversations about this, honoring both, because I'm not saying one is better than the other, but there's plenty of studies that show that as a feminine embodies leadership and more masculine traits, it actually changes the biology of their body. So if they're not invited to step back into their feminine, then those changes become more and more permanent, and it's kind of against nature or their biological will. So I think it's very, very important for us to own who we are, and keep our hearts open so that we can communicate in a fashion that we can be understood by the other person.
I do want to echo that a little bit, in the sense of, I don't know if it goes exactly with, say, genetic gender assignments, but
Sure.
The idea of kind of a dichotomy that exists and that we're seeing here, I do think we are all equipped with different tools, different equipment,
Yep.
capabilities, emotional capabilities, and styles. Some of that's trained, some of it is potentially born. If I try to morph myself into who you are as a chef and a leader, it's not going to feel right. Like,
Right. Yeah, right.
I kind of like my curly hair.
Nothing wrong with that.
Do you want to look at these stats real quick?
Yeah, I mean, Chowco, and again, these organizations have done a lot of detail work. So, the statistics are 63% of hospitality professionals suffered from depression, 84% feel stressed from their jobs. I mean, the statistics just go on. And as compelling as they are, I don't think it's as compelling as, telling stories. So that's why I think it's very important for us to be able to be courageous enough to tell our stories about what's going on. There was probably 2 times in my career where I had clinical breakdown and one as an executive sous chef at like 24 years old. And we opened up a restaurant where I was doing 90 hours a week because, that's what the job took. And I was very proud of the job I did. And a operations manager came up and patted me on the back and said, Adam, I just want to let you know that, people are seeing what you're doing and way to go and keep it up. And I said, thanks, Ronnie. And I turned around and went into the little locker room that was the / electrical room / kitchen locker room, shut the door, and I just cried for about 2 hours. Great heaving sobs, like not just a little thing, but just like because the energy was so caught up in my body, I had no other way to process it except to get that out. But in those moments, one can feel very, very alone.
Okay, well, and based on that, and that story really resonated with me. I was kind of reacting to like the whole, like keep it up, and you're like,
right,
keep it up. Okay, I'm doing it. But let's look around the room. Like, how many of y'all had a similar story where you were busting your chops to
thank you.
sorry, to keep up an intensity and a high performance, and then you're just like, oh my god, I have to keep going. The skill just keeps going.
Yeah.
So, show of hands, how many of y'all are there or have been there? Yeah, I mean, that's the majority of us in this room. Yeah. And I can tell you, there was a podcast episode that I did where I asked the chef, what was your oh shit moment? And they told the story of having done service on the line. And it was just like, oh my God. And so they tell me the story of sitting down on a 5-gallon bucket in the middle of service.
Oh, yeah.
Going, okay, what am I doing here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, am I showing up with alignment to my values, to alignment to the vision that we have for our lives, or are we just sprinting in a direction and not really thinking about if we're going straight at a cement wall or brick wall,
yeah.
or over a cliff, or both at the same time?
Yeah.
Sometimes what it feels like. So I think acknowledging, the statistics and really understanding the majority of us have a lot of stuff on our plates. And what are the organizations that exist to help us? So let's pivot the conversation a little bit.
But before you go there, I just, I recognize in my own career, and I don't know how many other people have felt this way, but that at any given point in my career, where I was versus where I wanted to be, I thought I just needed to grind harder. Mm-hmm. I thought I needed to pedal faster in order to get there. And I see some heads nodding in the crowd. And again, that can be an incredibly lonely feeling right there. And the fact is that what my career has shown is that none of those things are important. None of those things are really going to get me where I need to be. And it was, again, only by pivoting to the power of my open heart, which is really the only point of distinction that any of us have, to make a difference, or to actually show up in a space that can really significantly change lives just by our way of being. It's not like we have to promote anything or talk about anything in particular, but just our way of being invites others to do the same. And that's all the encouragement some folks need.
Yeah, so definitely. I think that's the other thing too. When all of us have had these stories is when service just goes badly, right? But the next guest at the next table didn't know what had just happened to the previous guest. The next shift doesn't know. And every time we go in and open is a new day. And so kind of the same thing, even though I showed up poorly on Monday, on Tuesday, I do have an opportunity to redo.
Yeah. One of the things that I was really enjoyed about yesterday was, you kept asking the same thing to a bunch of folks about, so when did the imposter syndrome show up for you? And almost everybody was like, holy crap. Okay, right now. But again, I think that that's kind of part and parcel of our journey. And if the imposter syndrome is showing up, it means you're doing something right. You're on the path to something. And I very often say that, being a solopreneur or an entrepreneur may be lonely, but being a visionary sucks. And I mean that for everybody in this room, because we can envision an outcome that may not necessarily be apparent to others. We are by classification visionaries. And sometimes it's really hard to convince others that possibility exists. Like, I know very, very strongly to the core of my bones, since the minute I walked into the first restaurant where I washed dishes, that things could be different. I knew it. And I think everybody probably does. And yet you kind of, in the frog of the beaker, kind of get stewed into that sauce. And like, now all of a sudden in the 80s, as a chef growing up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, I became that passionate chef that threw pans around and, not pans, but, yelled, and as a way of like, and that behavior was enabled. Oh, he's very creative. Like, that's such horseshit. Right?
Let's call it.
Right, exactly. Call it for what it is. And so I'm thankful to even be here because there's a lot of us that aren't. And so the organizations that have popped up pre-pandemic and during the pandemic really took on a lot of steam. Not9to5.org is an organization out of Canada that has a huge amount of resources for anybody in the industry that wants to create change. The Burn Chef Project, again, started in England. And this is where I started getting like kind of weirded out because it seemed like a lot of the work was being done outside of the United States. Like they were the ones that were starting to recognize it. And the Burn Chef now is a huge organization all over the world. And then Cooks Who Care, with my dear friend, Chef Maria Campbell out of Philadelphia, which is more of a community-based support group, serving those who serve. Chowco.org out of Denver, and now it's expanding rapidly because what they offer really works. And I Got Your Back is a program that is now served by not 9 to 5, but it was started by Chef Patrick Mulvaney in Sacramento, California, because they started seeing chef suicides in their community, and they said, well, what the hell are we going to do about it? And it's a very, very simple idea. There's a shoebox at the time clock, and there's 3 little pieces of paper with smiley faces. One's sad, one's neutral, and one's happy. And the idea is, as people clock in, they drop the face into the box. And during pre-meal, they open up the box and they say, okay, taking the temperature of the room, looks like somebody's, having some difficulty. And there's one person in the back of the house and one person in the front of the house that has a little purple hand pin on it. And they're the liaisons during that shift where people can go to. So it's a very kind of grassroots, nuts and bolts, bootstrapped way of, again, affecting change in an organization at the ground level. And I struggle with this because I know that a lot of organizations create culture in the boardroom and put posters up everywhere, but I also know that culture is created at the lowest levels, elbow to elbow when no one else is looking. That's why, some guys can get away with murder, treating people like shit, because no one is looking that closely. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, even though the problem might seem so big, to realize that, if all politics is local, then so is our culture, and we can affect change right where we're at.
I'll double click on that too, because the culture in an organization is the behavior that we allow to happen by the performers that you rely on for your bottom line. So if I am your highest performer and I'm an absolute jerk, then your culture is of absolute jerks. So let's call that out too, because just because you're performing and making your numbers does not mean that that's something that we should allow. I'm not saying tank the business, but I am saying how do we affect change differently? Because if we allow that to happen quarter over quarter, year over year, this is your culture. It's not your posters.
Right, exactly. So where do we want to pivot to now?
Well, let's talk about what we can do. So a lot of us are not in restaurants now,
right.
Not directly. So what's our call to action? So what are some lessons that we can learn? Let's talk about that together.
So, one of the topics that I like to bring up is emotional intelligence. And I think some people are unclear, as I was, because when I first saw that, I thought, oh, it's the difference between immaturity and maturity. And what I recognized is for lots of varied reasons. The folks who come into our industry are very passionate. Chef, this is all I ever wanted to do. And, this is my life. And I would say very often, great, go get a hobby. And they say, but it's my life. And I'm like, yeah, you need to go get a hobby, because without some other creative endeavor, you're setting yourself up for failure to get all your satisfaction from one area of your life. And, the restaurant industry is a tough mistress. You wake up in the middle of the night and in your middle ages, cold and alone, and wondering what the hell happened. Yeah. And that's probably why there's more than a few of us in this room that decided that maybe the restaurant industry wasn't necessarily what we wanted to be, and then pivoted to research and development, which I think is something that I want to celebrate, because if you're a chef and you're just starting out, it's not just restaurants and hotels. It's research, it's development, it's healthcare, it's senior living communities, which now are some of the most dynamic food programs going.
Yeah, there's education, technical sales, applications. Shoot. I was like, I could just name everybody's job title in here.
So, but I do agree that emotional intelligence is something that not only serves us at work, but it also serves us in our personal lives as well. And I think that's one of the new challenges for folks in the industry, is to start viewing and valuing their associates as whole human beings, and not just how they show up at work, or that they're a pair of hands or a brain.
Yeah, let's go over some of the keywords that are on the screen.
Yeah. So the 4 core elements of emotional intelligence are self-awareness, self-regulation, social communication skills, and empathy. Well, I think we got empathy clock since we heard that so many times.
that was the one with the most.
Right. And maybe one of the ones that is probably least talked about is this idea of self-awareness. And for a long time, I didn't want to think about my mind. The things that were going on in my heart were just so dark. I didn't want to go there. But improving my self-awareness gave me the capacity, again, not only to know myself much deeper, but also to start to want to know others. Mm-hmm. Because somewhere in my career, I had to pivot from the I or the me to the we. And for me, that moment was very impactful, because for me, it kind of marked a very clear line in the sand when I became less self-involved and more involved in the team. And for me, that was kind of like, oh, I'm going from the immature to the mature professional, and goddamn, doesn't that feel good?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a nice skill area of skill that we develop on the line,
right?
Or even in the lab, right, where titrations are really difficult, and I usually go blowing past them. You're like, well, everything's purple now, cool. And then you get better at it, right? And
right.
You practice these, and the first, 49 times you go up there, you're like, well, I screwed that one up again, cool. Again, new service, new day, new lights, let's go. And then I think I do think sometimes crisis will drag you into some of these lessons.
Without a doubt,
right?
yeah.
Either again by not showing up greatly, if you will, or taking stock of what didn't go well. My favorite activity at work, believe it or not, is after action reports, because I love to sit down with the team and say, well, what did we mean to have happen? Right. And what did actually happen? What are the things we can do differently next time?
Mm. Yep. One of the hardest lessons I ever had to learn, or actions to take, I was taking a series of trainings out in Las Vegas. It was a form of EST training that started out in San Francisco, and there's people probably have heard Landmark and Forum, and this was in the same vein. It was called Choice Center. It was run by 2 women, so it was a little bit more touchy-feely and not quite so in your face, although there were those moments. And one of the first actions that they had us take was to, on the break, go and call 3 people that you know and ask them if they trust you. And one of the people that I chose was my nephew, my sister's son. And I had to ask, knowing that, the answer could be yes or no. And he told me straight up no. And I kind of like set my ass back on the concrete. And I said, well, why? He says, well, because you just show up inconsistently. And he had his reasons for it. But for me to be willing to ask that question is one place, but then to be willing to actually hear it without, making him wrong or whatever. To me, that was like a huge part of my self-awakening. It's like, holy crap, this is not how, I'm not showing up the way that I wanted to. And how else am I supposed to know that if I'm not willing to put my ass on the line and actually ask those types of questions?
Yeah, and trust is earned.
Yeah.
Over years, over small investments and over big investments that, boy, can get destroyed really quickly too. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking like consistency as cooks and chefs. You can either cook something consistently and you're dependent upon in the line, or you're like, okay, cool, I'm not going to have you touch that expensive protein that I get a friend.
Right, but I mean, you're going to have to. I mean, that moment is going to have to come at some point, because sometimes there's no other way to learn how to clean a tenderloin than cleaning a tenderloin, right? I mean, some culinary schools have gotten to where, those meat fabrication courses are, slides on a screen, and that's as close as you get. And that's never going to teach you what you need. And I just wanted to point out one other thing here about how to improve self-awareness is use positive self-talk. So in my entire career, I've danced in the devil with pale moonlight many, many times. I mean, I just didn't know what to do with myself at the end of service when I'm so cranked up and just really juiced. And then I go out and like, okay, so what am I supposed to do with this energy? And it wasn't until not too long ago that I realized that truly my addiction was to my negative self-talk, because I'd be taking actions at 2:00 in the morning at an ATM downtown. And as Chris Rock says, there's nothing good happening at an ATM at 2:00 in the morning. And then would wake up in the morning and in a desperate panic, trying to figure out like, how the hell am I going to hide this from my wife? Right. And then having that negative self-talk loop all day long. And so I recognized that the other things were just a tool to a particular end, that really my addiction was to my own negative self-talk. And that probably was the biggest challenge for me is how do I pivot that? And we talked a little bit about yesterday about the imposter syndrome, and I think you called out that just being able to share with internally, like, thanks very much, I got this. And then I mentioned to you, well, my ego's name is Sluggo, and that's from the old Nancy comic, Sluggo, you know, spiky, chopped up hair. And it took me a while to realize that he's only doing that as a protection mechanism for me. Our egos are only trying to keep us safe. Don't put your hand up. Don't stick your head out of the foxhole. Don't do that. Don't get called out. You know, in England and Australia, they have this thing called the tall poppy complex, which is if you put your hand up, you know, if you look at a field of poppies, they're all very uniform except for that one that stands straight higher than the other one. They're the first ones to get clipped. And so euphemistically, that's how those public school systems are. So that we get conditioned very, very early not to put ourselves out, not to get called out. And our egos are constantly working to keep us emotionally safe. And I just had to come to the point where I say, Sluggo, I got this. Thanks, you know, thanks for caring. Fuck you for sharing. I got this. It's okay. You know, but it's, for me, that's what work is like, to call that negativity out so that I can pivot and take, again, that pattern interrupt, just a deep breath. And so that I can continue in a different vein, because that's not the way I want to show up to others. Not that that's the most important thing for me. Most important thing for me is actually feel good about myself and feel that I'm making a difference, that I have a purpose in my life. And, you know, this is a great example of me fulfilling on that. But this idea of like allowing that negative self-talk to take any space in your day. And there are ways in which you can pivot from that. First thing, I guess, would be to become self-aware. Like, oh, that's not really the truth. It's just a very well-practiced way of being or thinking, and it's just a story.
Yeah.
Your ego just has a story, you know, and you can tell yourself a different story.
And I think some of that, you know, as a female and high performer, I do identify as a high performer media striver.
Yeah.
But the laugh track and critics panel that I've got in my head is pretty deep. And so, you know, there have been times that I'll, you know, come out of their presentation and I'm just like, wow, that was really dumb.
Right.
And it was like, okay, pause. Would you tell that to your chef partner who's in that presentation with you? Would you tell that to your sales partner? Would you say that to your whoever is walking out of that show with you? No, you would not say 3/4 of the stuff out loud to any other human that you're saying to yourself. So if you're not willing to or should not say those things out loud to another human, do not say them to yourself, right? And I think for me, my sense of self-awareness that's dangerous is I'll say those things to myself and I'll justify it and say, well, but I'm also a high striver. So if I'm not cutting myself down, if I'm not critiquing myself that I've got a big head, and then I'll have no idea if I'm doing a good job. And it's like, okay, it's one thing to reflect again on what did I need to have happen, what actually happened, what am I going to do differently. And it's another thing to be like, here, but right? And it spirals really differently. So self-awareness is also self-kindness. And I think it's fair for us to call ourselves on that because, again, for the humans in this room and who are listening to this podcast who I call and I'm like, talk me out of this science hole that I've worked myself into. It's like, okay, yes, and you can science your way through this, you can chef your way through this, and just stop spinning. You know, don't spin yourself.
You sound like Matt Damon as Martian. You know, I'm going to science the shit out of this.
Next slide, please.
I know. I mean, I don't even know if we need the extra slides or the slides because I think the conversation is going so beautifully, but and so fluidly. But I mean, we're going to talk about, you know, the other aspects of emotional intelligence, and certainly if you snap the picture of the QR code, you'll get the rest of the slide deck. But you know, I also want to be present to the fact that, you know, we've got an hour and we're 40 minutes in, so and I want to make room for some questions and stuff. But for you, what's really present right now?
What's really present in my head?
Well, in your head, in the space, in the conversation.
You know, I think what I'm really holding space for right now is just wanting to understand the call to action for us as chefs and leaders here, right? What are we doing as an organization? What are we doing as members of the organization? How are we showing up for each other? That's the question that I've got in my head right now. And have you been able to like pinpoint any actions? Like we've had lots of conversations over the last couple of days. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would ask, has there anything that's been said that gives you hope that there's actually a place for us to start showing up in this way? You know, there are a couple of things. First, so many of the familiar faces here that I'm like, okay, you decided to show up, you decided to show up. All right, I'm back in. Chips are back on the table, so let's do this, right? So that's a piece of it, is understanding the humans that we got to see and hang out with this week are the reason that I continue to be so active. And I think my question for me, I think, is how do I want to show up here? Do we continue to have these conversations and talk about mental health for research chefs? Do we talk about that for our companies and brands that we work for? You know, that's what's going to be.
Yeah, I think it would be a serious misjudgment to think that that the mental health stripes that, you know, and all the statistics that we saw do not equally apply here as they do in other areas. I got to think that, you know, yeah, we still have the same stressors. We still have, you know, bosses that are untenable or did not appreciate what we're going through. A lot of the conversations I keep getting into, I keep hearing the same thing, which is chefs feel unseen, they feel undervalued, they feel like nobody's really communicating with them, that nobody really wants to hear what they have to say. And I recognize that that is the same for everybody. And you know, the whole idea about not being appreciated, I would ask, like, who needs to appreciate you? Like, why are we gaining or where are we deriving appreciation from? Because I know in my career, it became very apparent that, you know, being in the restaurant business or in the culinary industry, there's this great aptitude for instant gratification. You know, very often there's something that we're working on that we can get instant gratification for. If we're in a restaurant, we put the plate up, nobody tells us that's fantastic. You might be in the lab and having a result that immediately shows you that you're on the right track. Whereas in a lot of careers, you know, there is a aspect of delayed gratification that I think is also an aspect of becoming a mature professional. That so we're not seeking that type of instant gratification, but damn, it feels good when someone pats you on the back and says that's excellent. So I guess I would say I've had to learn to give myself that grace. You know, to treat myself with tenderness and kindness. And I use those words very, very deliberately because I recognize that no one is ever going to appreciate all the work I put into X. No one is ever going to know all the places I had to go in order to do this. Nobody's going to appreciate the fact of like what it took to actually set this podcast up, nor should they. But if I'm expecting that, hey, that was really cool, then I'm setting myself up for failure.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So showing up as a I don't want to say self-contained, but you know, as a whole person who can do for me without have anybody having to do for me, I think sets me up for a much deeper sense of success in the long run. Not to say that, you know, it would be great to get acknowledgement, but I don't really. Over the past couple of weeks, I've had to understand something very, very essential about me is I do what I do when I do it with whom I do it, because it feels good to live my life with an open heart, and that's got to be enough. I can't put any other attachment on it because when I do, I'll always be disappointed, and I would much rather not be disappointed if you get my feeling.
Well, let's chat with the room a little bit. There are folks in here who are like, okay, yeah, what does that mean? You know what I mean? So let's get some questions from the crowd, if you will. And thank y'all for showing up again. Any questions about, I guess, emotional intelligence, imposter syndrome? Would you like to hear what mine sounds like?
Mental health and wellness, yeah.
Mental health wellness, and then what can we do as an organization? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Kimberly. By the way, we're also giving away some T-shirts, so if you'd like to ask a question.
Make it a good question then.
Right, exactly.
I have a question kind of for the room.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my second RCA. I went to, my first one was in Atlanta, and I had a blast. I was also going through some personal stuff, mental health stuff. And it was so great to meet so many people, make all these connections. And the hardest thing was coming back to work the next week and going from having so much interaction and also coming from a pandemic where, you know, we weren't so socially interacting, and all of a sudden having all the stimulation, and then the next week going back to kind of that isolated environment.
Right.
Has anyone else had that similar experience the next week after RCA? And I'm sorry to thinking of like strategies of how, but it was anyone willing to share like what they do to kind of come down from the high of the show, and you know where I'm going. You're not.
Yeah. So the question for the online audience is, it's fantastic to be part of a conference and you're all charged up with all this interaction. Then you go back to your regular job and there's this emotional cliff that you go over sometimes. And how do you handle that?
So let's have Jeff Chris give that one a go.
Right. That's a really, really good question. And that's, I think, the hardest part sometimes of what we do is that when we're around each other, it's so communal, and that environment comes, it clicks right back in, being on the line or anything else, just fall right back into place. And you find that rhythm that you don't otherwise have. So what you do when you don't have that rhythm? The answer is reach out and talk to people and use the tools you have, which sometimes is the hardest part. I'm guilty of this. Like just last night, Kimberly and I were talking about the fact that, like I made this big move, we've done stuff, and neither one of us had any idea what was going on in each other's lives because we got busy and fell off and stopped communicating. And that's a failure as peers, as friends, as everything else. And so that's something we have to recover, but it also has to kind of be blameless because it's the circumstances of life, it's the things that happen, so you can't put the fault on it and keep yourself when you're down. We just reach out, we talk to people, and we have some tools we've tried to put in place in this industry, like with the Discord, to keep people talking as much as possible, but it does take proactivity. And I think one thing that happens a lot is we often fear, like, oh, I don't want to bug that person, or I don't want to interrupt. I know they're busy, they're going on with a lot, but they're saying the exact same thing to themselves, and their friends are saying the same thing, their parents are saying the same thing, and everybody's just getting caught in that kind of block where we're like, I don't want to bother anybody. This is my problem, so I'll just deal with it and I'll put it off. And I think that's something I'm incredibly guilty of all the time. So I think really the only thing we can do is remember that we're all in the same boat, and that like it's that same vibe when you get here. You realize everybody has your back. Like we still do, even when we're not in wherever we are, whether it's Savannah or Boston or wherever else. Like where it doesn't change just because there's distance in them, and that's fine. We can close that gap out.
Well said. Pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Pick it up.
I guess I'll say this, like, I get super stoked when I get a text from somebody in our RCA group where we have a work chat as well. And I get, we'll get random pictures, we'll get check-ins, and we'll get the whole, can you talk me off the science edge here? And I honestly, it does actually serve as a pause for me to stop sitting through Instagram, because that's fun-ish, but it's actually not very soul-filling. But when I get a text from my chef friends and they're like, hey, just making sure you're kicking over there, or I have a question, don't want to bother you, blah, blah, blah. Like, you're not a bother. I'd love to be able to help. And I think that's the other piece, too, that I had to learn this past calendar year was I really had, the story I told myself was that I was alone and that I really couldn't let people know that things were going a bit sideways and random stuff for me. And then it was just like, hey, how are you doing? And I was like, it's not really great right now. And acknowledging that, I was so surprised by the people at work and in my personal life who were like, well, then let us help you. You don't have to carry this tent alone. So let us pick up the other sides of this. And I think it was both humbling and refreshing to see just how my teammates really picked up the weight to talk to customers, to take care of some tasks that would normally fall onto my job title, but I was overwhelmed. And they were like, yeah, no, we're happy to do this. And it's not being held over me. It's not an assessment of not being good at my job. It was, well, we're teammates. We're going to do this with you. And I think that actually can translate out into the industry as well, of saying, if you raise your hand and say, I don't actually know how to do this, I've been surprised at how many folks are like, I would love to help you with this. It's like, really? Like, no, I really would. You've got this experience, folks in this room have experiences that we haven't had time on the line to develop those skills. And some people have incredible superpowers in certain spaces. So let's let those superheroes do those cool things so that you can actually show up as your own superhero. I've told a lot of people, like, if you're Wonder Woman, do not try to drive the Batmobile.
That's from Batman. It's so easy to become siloed in our organizations, right? Because that's where we're living and breathing. And I think that what's so powerful, one of my go-to questions always is, how can I support you? And I'm always amazed because, there's a good portion of folks who don't really have an idea. someone who I respect and care for very deeply. She went through a small surgical procedure. Her partner couldn't be there for her. She texted me yesterday to say that everything had gone smoothly and she was great. I'm like, great, how can I support you? Would Chinese takeaway do it? She's like, yeah, I would love that. And Express, da, 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 da. So it just took me a couple minutes to just go on my phone and look it up, and 3 o'clock, the lunch was delivered. And that felt really, really good to me. And it might have seemed like a small thing, but I think it's also an interesting thing about like actually being able to articulate to somebody what would actually support you. Because again, sometimes we don't really know until we're actually in the moment and someone's offering that. Because it might be that, before picking up the phone, you're like, oh, I don't want to bother them, da, 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 and not really knowing what it is that you need. And that's totally okay. But that you actually take the action, I think is the thing that's most important. And then not be so like bought up in your own shit that you can't just say what you need, because most people I think would be like, I think generally speaking, almost everybody wants to help. But sometimes they just don't know. They don't have any framework for what or context for what you're going through, or what specifically, maybe it's just that one little piece of information, or maybe it's, to sit down and have a cup of coffee or whatever it is that would most serve you. And I think that's really probably the deeper question. Not to say that you shouldn't pick up the phone anyway, but when it gets to that point, it just feels so good, because if not, then actually what you're doing is you're holding everybody else small. You're telling yourself that they have no capacity to be able to help you, right? And so sometimes we think, oh, we don't want to bother them, but what we're actually saying to them is like, you can't help me, which I think for most people would be like, what? I'd love to help you, right? So yeah, very interesting perspectives.
Kind of double clicking though on just how to stay connected. So Instagram memes are really fantastic. So feel free to send me cat pictures. That was fun. But also the RCA Hustlers Discord page is open to everyone. It was started for folks kind of in their first decade of the career, but we have so many different channels on that, from career advice to just for science and experiments that went well or poorly, or we're not really sure. Like, there's a lot of ways for us to engage through the Discord page, which was kind of our gap fill when we were in between websites, if you will. And then shout out to Gregory for reviving the website. We have the RSS again of the, hey, I'm looking for a supplier of magical unicorn powder, so can you help me? And it's like, oh yeah, talk to so-and-so, talk to this person. Oh, I don't know if you want to use it for that application. Like, all of that information is there. And I think what's fun about the RCA and what really struck a chord with me 4 million years ago when I joined was just, these are my people. And even though we are active and fun-loving competitors with each other out there, in here, we are helping each other, we are sharing knowledge, we're sharing connections. And I would take advantage of that, because you do have a superpower of your own. And honestly, you work in a brand and a company that a lot of us need to work with. So offer up the company services, offer your own developing superpowers, and identify, and let us help you identify what those superpowers are, so we can call to you as well. And the other thing I'm really excited about with the latest RCA board is the prior one worked so hard to keep us on the track, and they did. And so now we've got an opportunity to get the engine rolling again and to build that inertia again. And we have young RCA Hustler leaders in leadership positions now. And I'm super stoked for that, because the founders of the RCA needed to create an organization that really identified with research chefs and really could serve us. And now our next generations are coming up to say, okay, well, what does research chefing look like today? And what can we do for the future? Our future, the next gen future. We've got student committees, we've got universities and professors who are slugging it out. They always need guest speakers, so reach out to any of the universities and become a mentor there. And there's something to be said about volunteering to identify what your strengths are, and then also to start investing in the lives of the next gen. I can think of folks that I love to follow today who were students when I was a young professional, and now I'm getting to see them as young professionals, and I'm just like blown away by how impressive they are.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Yeah. Any final words? Or was that?
Thank you all so much for just being here today, being part of this conversation, for
Thank you. Thank you. I feel all warm and fuzzy right now.
You're welcome. Thank y'all.
Yeah.